Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Atiawa me Taranaki, ko Alice Tupunga Somerville Lahau. I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden-funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. Kia ora, this is the Writing the New World podcast. This is the podcast that is designed to share information, ideas, stories, kōrero connected to the Marsden-funded project Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background. It's kind of like what really happened between, the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. Each episode of the podcast is going to be hosted by the doctoral student Wanda Iremia Allen, who worked as an MPhil scholarship student on this project, but who also has done paid research connected to the project before moving into that work, and since then has moved into doctoral studies, extending the work that she did as an MPhil student. Wanda is going to be the voice that you'll hear every week, asking questions, engaging with our different researchers. The podcast is going to be distributed through all the usual networks, Apple, Google, on YouTube, Facebook. We've got a Twitter feed. So just tune in however you normally would to listen to a podcast or to watch these kinds of videos. And please feel free to share them. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities. Really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more.
Kia ora! Welcome to the Writing the New World podcast. I'm your host, Wanda Iremia Allen, and today you'll be hearing from the wonderful Emma Powell, a PhD student from Victoria, who is currently conducting research in the Cook Islands, Rarotonga. Enjoy.
My first name is Emma. That is not a tupuna name. It's not from my papaanga or my genealogy. Emma is a name that my mother liked and she decided to use for my first name. My second name is Emily. Emily is the name of my papa'a grandfather's mother. She was English and she was from a town called Surrey in England. I never met her unfortunately, though she passed away just before my grandparents were going to take me to England, so that was a shame. My third name is Ngakuraevaru. That is my Māori name, and I'm very proud of it. It's my Achuan name, and that is after my great-great-grandmother, and she was an Achuan. And then obviously my last name is a papa'a surname, and that's from my papa'a grandfather. I know my Achuan side. I grew up with my grandparents, and so I'm very familiar with my maternal papaanga, which is from the island of Achu. My family have links to most of the villages in Achu. My mother was brought up in Te Nui and Areora, and her father was from the village of Te Ngātangi. And so I know myself mostly as an Achuan person. My Mum's mother has links to Bora Bora, which is north of Tahiti and Raiatea to the east. And my grandfather from Tingatangi had connections to Tahiti Nui through his grandparents. But we have connections to all of the islands in the Cook Islands, and my father is from the wonderful island of Mangaia, which I've not yet visited. But that's me.
So do share with us what you have done to contribute towards the project of writing the New World.
Sure. So I became involved with the project through some of the master's work that I'd done in 2012. The principal investigator of this project is someone that I have worked with before. That's Alice Tepunga Somerville. And so I've already done a lot of research and writing about Cook Islands writers before and the history of our writing. And so there were conversations early on about me helping out at some point on this project, just because of my interest in Cook Islands writing. And then after conversations with Alice, I came on board to look specifically at the writing of Marjorie Tuina-Kore-Crocombe and Florence Johnny Frisbee, two of our most well-known writers in the Cook Islands. And so my task was really to gather a record of all of the things these women had written, where they were published, what year, a bit of information around the circumstances of those publications, how and why they decided to write at that time, and really just to collate a collection of these details for the principal researcher to use when she goes to write up her research project.
What does the work of Marjorie Crocombe and Johnny Frisbee tell us about the history of Cook Islands writing?
These two women are really incredible. They're really incredible. So Mama Margie was one of the earliest graduates from USP. She was a foundation student. She was also someone that was part of establishing USP, actually, back in the day, the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. And a lot of her experience at the University of Papua New Guinea with Ulibea was actually really formative in her experience as a young scholar, you know, even though she had had all of this experience in New Zealand. And so she was crucial to starting so many different groups and encouraging and supporting her colleagues and peers to publish, to write, to be forthright in some of their thinking and their movements and activism at that stage, which is one of her major contributions to the history of the region and actually the intellectual heritage that we've inherited from that generation. Mama Johnny was one of the earliest Indigenous women in the Pacific to publish. So she published her autobiography in 1942, and she would have been around 14 or 15 at that time. She was assisted and supported by her father, Robert Frisbee, who was American originally, but was also a writer himself. And they were living on Puka Puka. And so this first autobiography of hers, Miss Ulysses, was based on Puka Puka and really told about her life when she grew up there.
How prolific were the writers? Why not? And what were you able to find out about the writers?
So both of these women were clearly really prolific. Margie has quite an incredible list of publications. They both publish a lot of different kinds of writing, which is also interesting about both of them. I don't think anybody would deny how influential they have been. Mama Margie and Mama Johnny are both looked to as a generation of first writers who were producing English writing and texts and books at a time when there were just so few of us. There were so few of us doing that work. Other authors like Albert Wendt, Patricia Grace in New Zealand, Witi Ihimaera in New Zealand, they start publishing and really growing their profile around the 70s and 80s. And what's interesting about these two women is that actually they were working on writing and producing writing for a fair amount of time before that, and so I think that more than exemplifies how prolific they were and still are. Yeah.
So how did you get involved with the project? How did you find the material for your contribution to writing the new world?
So I did my undergraduate in English. One of my degrees was in English at undergrad, and then I went on to do my master's in English literature at the University of Auckland as well, and that was in 2012. That thesis that I wrote actually focused on the history of Cook Islands writing in English. And part of that project was driven by my sort of frustration and also amazement that Cook Islanders had been the first to publish a novel in the Pacific. Papa Tom's work, Papa Tom Davis, was one of the earliest novelists, and to my knowledge, the first published Indigenous Pacific novelist at that time. And there were all of these, including, you know, Mama Margie and Mama Johnny, and having all of these different firsts. And so it encouraged me to write my master's, which sort of wrote itself in the end, if you know what I mean, because our people are amazing. And we have an incredible, I can't say that enough, we just have this incredible tradition, intellectual tradition, but also a tradition of writing that goes back a really long time, and we don't often know or celebrate it. And so that's what my master's project was about. You can see how this fits in with this project, and that this project looks specifically at Cook Islands writing as a component, but also looks at Pacific writing in general over the 20th century. And so obviously a lot of my work already looked at that. Mama Johnny and Mama Margie were absolutely a part of my work in that thesis. So already I had looked at I'd already looked at a whole lot of their writing already, especially their major texts. Mama Margie and Mama Johnny published different genres. So Mama Margie wrote a lot of academic essays. She was an editor of various different collections. She edited poetry. She wrote a lot of children's literature and educational texts. Mama Johnny did the same, so she had a lot of educational texts as well. So I was familiar generally with that work and ended up coming across that work already through my master's, and that's how I came into this project as well, is that my experience with my master's project made it kind of a no-brainer, really, to be part of this project, yeah.
So who were the audience of the...
You know, I suspect that both of these women had no idea the kinds of people their writing would reach. I think when they sat down to write it, they really thought that it was only children that were going to read certain things, you know. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm guessing wrong, but I think that the audience is just hard to define for these two women because they're so important. Because they're so prolific, and they were doing it so early, and they were producing high quality, excellent writing, of course people want to read what these two incredible women have to say. And so I don't think there's any way to sort of characterise their audience. I think researchers love reading them, even if it's just poetry. Mama Johnny's short story, The Bed. The Bed as a short story is about this bed that is gifted to an auntie, I think it is, and this idea that the bed shouldn't be slept on in Puka Puka or wherever it is, on a remote island somewhere. And this experience of like how, you know how Māori people, furniture is really important. Like if it's nice furniture, you don't sit on it. They don't lie on it, you know? And so this short story is about this bed and how important it is. And that story has been quoted and reprinted in all sorts of different contexts because it's Mama Johnny, and because she was such an amazing writer. So I think the answer to that is hard to characterise the audience, but many, many, many people still love reading their writing.
What other Indigenous and Pacific texts were written during this time?
In the region, it's interesting, because they were some of the earlier writers, especially in English, they were kind of the first people before other people came to write alongside them. Do you know what I mean? Because they were the first. And so, Mama Maji is well connected. Many, many people of her generation know her, are very fond of her, have lots of nice things to say about her, were supported by her in Paparon. And so I think those writing alongside her at the time, people like Albert Wendt, who was the main one, Pilsoni Niko from Rotuma and Fiji, who else? Many other people of her generation, I think, yeah. And she was writing alongside all of them. Mama Johnny, for me personally, is a little bit different in that I see her so much as this adventurer, is that she's lived a life always on the move, and because she almost pulled out ahead of people when she decided to write her autobiography and get it published, it almost feels like even though there was other writing happening at the time, she's her own sort of star.
So were there any recurring themes? If so, what am I?
That's a hard one, eh? They've written about so many things. Mama Maji wrote a lot about our history. She wrote a lot about important people in our history. She wrote amazing stories and things for our children. Mama Johnny's was autobiographical. I always find threads of puka throughout her work. So yeah, I think the recurring themes are about home and about identity, and about the region and how important the Pacific is.
Great. So did you enjoy working with this archive, this published material? Why? Oh, why not?
I always enjoy anything to do with the Cook Islands, to be honest. My background as a researcher is in literature, but I do a lot of different kinds of work around the Cook Islands, and so anything about the Cook Islands I enjoy working on. This has been particularly important, and it's been really fulfilling because I did my thesis, like I said, a long time ago now, and but it's a topic that I'll always keep coming back to because writing is really important to me and our stories are really important to me. And so, it's been really fulfilling working on this project and being able to go back to, reading and diving in and thinking about the work of these two women and our people.
Right. So, would you like to read a piece of Mama Marge or Mama Johnny's writing to us and give us your personal response?
I'm not going to read anything, but I will probably point out that in a lot of Mama Margie's works, she'll usually write a dedication at the start, especially the volumes that she wrote to children. For example, 200 Changing Years was dedicated to the future generations of Cook Islanders and Islanders really in general to come. And she makes that, I think it's in They Came for Sandalwood as well. In that volume, she also, at the beginning, she writes a dedication to the children to come and hopefully the writers to come. And she really encourages the next generation to write their own stories and to publish about their own histories. And it gets me every time I see that in Mama Margie's work because it's just so ahead of her time. She was always thinking about, okay, but what comes next? What is this all for? And how do we keep dreaming our future? And when I see those dedications written in the books, I just feel really grateful to her for doing that because it was like she was already preparing for us, to come and do this work that you and I are doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Have you been any writing from the authors that you consider to be seminal or particularly influential on Pacific or Indigenous studies?
They're all pretty influential in their own way, I think. Part of it is about those firsts, but I think for Mama Johnny, and this is also, again, really personal, subpersonal kind of perspective, is that her autobiographical writing is special because it comes from a Māori pukapukan woman, a young woman experiencing her world, and it resonates with me as someone that is also a Cook Island person. When you read her autobiography, it almost gives you permission to say, oh, that's my story too. And with Mama Margie, there is one seminal, I think it's seminal at this point, is that in her second issue of the Mana Journal, which she was editor of, and that came out of Fiji, in the second issue, she writes a passage which is sort of referred to, I guess, now by a lot of people as the essay where she says the canoe is afloat. And in that editorial kind of commentary, she refers, the canoe is actually the group of writers that are about to go forward and start producing this new writing and thinking in the region. And she writes, the canoe is afloat, to say the canoe of these new writers, the waka of these new writers and thinkers from our islands is ready to disembark and it's going to take off, you know. And there are a lot of people who have written about that essay that she wrote or that kind of commentary that she wrote, this editorial. And it does mark a moment, I think, in the history of Pacific writing where all of a sudden Mama Margie says, right, the waka's taken off, it's on the ocean, it's carrying on, it's cool, get ready, you know, which is really an amazing, I think, moment in her writing and for us all who study Pacific writing.
So
it's really important, eh? And part of it comes back to that, to being able to recognise ourselves in those stories. I'm not saying that outsiders can't do this work too. I'm not saying that Papa'a people can't do research on the Cook Islands. But we have spent too long engaging with research work that has not been written by Cook Islanders, that if it was written by Cook Islanders, I wonder whether we would be able to recognise it. And of course I think we would, but it's important for Indigenous scholars to do this work because we have personal and intellectual stakes in that work. Nothing for us is unrelated. It means a lot to me that I know that other Cook Island Māori scholars are here doing the work because it's important to them. And because essentially they're doing work on themselves when they do work on other Cook Islanders, you know. And that's why I think it's really, really important that Indigenous scholars undertake this work. And I hope the numbers of Indigenous scholars continue to grow. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for future Indigenous scholars wanting to engage with your research? What direction would you like to point future scholars to?
I just don't feel like I have any work to leave behind at this point. I feel like I'm still following in the steps of people like Mama Margie, to be honest. I guess what I would say, though, this work can be really hard, and it can be really lonely. It can be incredibly lonely. Partly because maybe Papa'a people and Papa'a institutions are not interested in the work. That's partly it. But the other part is that your people may not be interested either. And that sucks. But that doesn't mean that you have to stop. And so I guess for people that come after me or even researchers that are doing this work and they're feeling a bit lonely too, is that it's worth it, you know? Like it is really worth being able to do this research work and feeling a bit lonely in it sometimes, even when nobody thinks it's really that important, because it is. we have a lot to be proud of as Cook Island people, and our intellectual tradition and our writing is one part of what we can be proud of. But it also deserves our attention, and it deserves our careful contemplation of how we are in it. What's important about it is that in our writing, in our stories, we might find ourselves, you know, because that is our history. And so I would say to anybody coming after me is to just really be strong, you know, have faith that it'll be worth it, you know. Research is not easy. It's really hard. It's really hard, you know. And for us, it's personal. For many others, it's not. But for us, it always is, especially if we're doing research on our own people and our own histories. It's always personal, and that's really, really important because it is personal. Other people don't have personal stakes in that work, and might not care in the same way that we do, and might not be able to see what we can see because it's a part of us. You know? Yeah, that's it. Cook Islands Language Week is really important, I think. As someone that grew up in the diaspora, so I grew up on Waiheke Island in Auckland. I was born in South Auckland. I grew up with my grandparents on Waiheke Island. Our family was, you know, one of very few Cook Island families on the island. And for me, it's really important as someone that grew up in that situation and in that context to think about the importance of our language, because I did not grow up with it, you know. And so for me, Cook Island Language Week has become a really important time for Cook Islanders outside of the Pukarea to think about how important our language is to us. And I'm really excited to see the growth and engagement with Cook Islands Language Week over the last 3 or 4 years. It's just gotten bigger and bigger, and it's really exciting, especially in the universities around the country, to see Te Puta Mō Te Reo Kuki Airani Māori be such an important part of our Cook Island students' lives. And it is a time where now we can make lots of space to think about the importance of our language and who we are as a people. So I think that's the opportunity that it offers us, time to really think about, especially for us in New Zealand and Australia, about who we are and why it's important we take care of our language.
So how can our Cook Islands texts help promote our language? What ways can this strengthen and develop the Māori language?
I think the Māori language has a lot of barriers, and it has a lot of things it's up against. And part of that is also is about revitalising the language and being able to use it with our families and with our children. One of the problems that we have with Reo Māori Kuki Airani is that we have a very low transmission through the generations. And so that makes the status of the language really precarious. What texts can help us do is provide a resource for educational purposes, for the teaching of our tamariki and mapu. And I think that the language revitalisation as well as the production of Cook Islands writing really go hand in hand. In the classroom, we do need resources that can help us learn and take care of our language, and that's about stories. You know, Te Reo Māori Kuki Airani is about us being able to describe the world on our own terms in our own language. Cook Island writing is also about being able to write our stories where we recognise ourselves as Māori, as Cook Island Māori people, and the stories that are being produced about us. Those things dovetail together. It's really important that Cook Island texts, whether that's poetry, whether that's short stories, whether that's children's literature, and our strategies for our reo, kia puawai, right, like they have in the theme this year, in order for it to bloom and to blossom and to really flourish, those things I think need to dovetail together, and so I think that's why Cook Islands texts are just really important for us in our reo Māori.
So, how do we encourage engagement with Cook Islands and Pacific writing?
Such a hard question. I have studied and researched Pacific writing in English for a really long time, and it's always been a question of mine about not only how we get more people engaging with it, but also how we get more people writing it, you know. And I think the classrooms are always a really important place to start. That's not to say that our people have not been telling stories since long before we ever got the first Bible, or we had the first printing machine, or Taonga and Mariti started writing, you know, for as missionaries. We have been doing stories for a long time before actual writing, but now we have an opportunity to start collating our knowledge, to start collating who we are in writing. And so I think it's really important that we encourage our mapu and our tamariki in schools, that we encourage a lot of our students going into universities, that we also make lots of room for our parents and our mamas and papas to also have their stories recorded somewhere. And I think it's not so much a matter of encouraging so much as it is to say to each other, it's important to us that we have these stories and that we continue to share them. And that's what Cook Island and Pacific writing is. It's our stories captured and put into a form that we can really share with our people and with our relations and our kin across the region.